Welcome to Tales That Terrify, the podcast that turns your deepest fears into chilling reality. Every week, we bring you fresh, unsettling stories designed to haunt your imagination. From whispers in the dark to the horrors just beyond your sight, these tales will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows. Want more nightmares? Dare to explore our YouTube channel for even more spine-tingling stories. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for this week's descent into terror. It was late in the season, somewhere in the thick of autumn, when Violet found herself standing at the edge of a crumbling ruin in the sleepy town of Alderstone. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the sunset bled out in hues of orange and purple that stained the sky like an old bruise. Her leather boots, worn and cracked, made no sound as they scuffed along the brittle earth. She ran her fingers through her dyed black hair, which was messy, long, and tangled with the wind. The world around her was silent, save for the occasional rustling of distant trees. A cold breeze ran through her, as if the wind had a mind of its own. Violet wasn't sure what had drawn her to Alderstone, but the pull was undeniable, like some distant whisper calling her to the old stones, the forgotten places where memories linger like shadows. She was a creature of the night, a Scorpio in her bones, and the darker energies of the world felt like a magnetic force she couldn't escape, nor did she want to. Her wardrobe consisted mainly of faded band tees and heavy, worn leather jackets, the remnants of a once sharp identity she hadn't fully understood but embraced all the same. Bands like The Cure and the Smashing Pumpkins were the soundtracks to her life, each note an echo of the melancholy that coursed through her veins. It was this darkness that led her to the ruins. The townsfolk had spoken of it in hushed voices, warning of a curse, of the midnight girl who had lived centuries ago. They said she had been a witch, and her passions were as wild as the storms that raged in the night sky. But she had vanished, as mysteriously as she had come. A quick glance at her phone, a simple text message from her best friend. "You're not going out there, are you?" Violet smiled faintly, knowing she wouldn't listen. She hadn't come this far just to turn back now. She stepped forward, her fingers grazing the weathered stones of the ruin as the setting sun dipped below the horizon. The place felt ancient, and for some inexplicable reason she felt at home here, like a part of her had been here before, in another life, or perhaps in a dream. Her fingers brushed a cold metal object embedded in the stones, and as she pulled it free, a sudden rush of electricity shot through her fingertips, sending a shock of warmth and dread across her chest. The pendant was heavy, old, the metal oxidized and darkened with time. A shape was carved into it, an intricate symbol that seemed to pulse in the fading light. A voice whispered in the back of her mind. "The awakening begins." Violet's breath hitched, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. She hadn't believed the stories, the old wives' tales of a spirit bound to the ruins. But now, in the presence of this strange artifact, the truth was becoming something she could feel deep in her gut, as real as the blood that pumped through her veins. Suddenly, the wind howled, and the air grew thick with an otherworldly energy. She stepped back, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as the earth beneath her seemed to shift. Violet dropped the pendant, watching it fall to the ground with a hollow, echoing thud. Before she could react, the ground trembled, and from the darkness of the ruins emerged a figure. A tall, shadowed form, draped in flowing black, hair wild as if it had been torn from the very night sky. The face that materialized before her was pale, strikingly beautiful, yet it held a haunting sadness. It was a woman, no, something more. Her presence was like a fever dream, dark and enticing. Violet's breath caught in her throat. "You found it," the woman whispered, her voice an eerie mix of longing and bitterness. "I have waited so long." Violet took a cautious step back, the air growing heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered. The woman's lips curved into a sorrowful smile. "I am the Midnight Girl, and you are me." A wave of confusion and recognition washed over Violet. Her heart pounded as the wind seemed to swirl around them, lifting her hair from her face. "You've awakened something," the Midnight Girl continued. "This world and the next have always been connected in ways you cannot yet understand. But you will. You will know the truth." Violet's pulse raced, the blood in her veins feeling as if it had turned to fire. She was both terrified and mesmerized. The air around them was heavy, filled with an energy that both aroused and unsettled her. "You are bound to me," the Midnight Girl said, her voice softening yet carrying an ominous weight. "We share a fate, the passion, the hunger. It is in our nature. You are the one I have waited for." Violet's hand trembled as she reached for the pendant at her feet, now glowing faintly with an ethereal light. The symbol on it seemed to shift, as if it were alive, as if it were speaking to her. The Midnight Girl's gaze pierced her soul. "Take it," the Midnight Girl whispered. "Take the final step, and you will feel it. The power, the freedom. You will never feel alone again." Violet's heart raced, her mind struggling to hold on to logic as the darkness around her deepened. Something about this felt inevitable, as if every moment of her life had led to this precise instant. With trembling hands, she lifted the pendant, and as the last light of day vanished, the earth trembled once more. The Midnight Girl's eyes glowed with an eerie intensity, and Violet felt something stir deep within her, a dark, irresistible longing. The curse had been broken, and Violet was no longer just a girl in a leather jacket. She had become something more, something ancient and untouchable. A creature of the night, like the Midnight Girl, bound by the same hunger. The world would never be the same again. I've always been drawn to the dark side of things. Maybe it's the way shadows cling to the edges of a room, or how the bass line of a Sisters of Mercy song feels like a heartbeat you didn't know you had. Whatever it is, I've embraced it fully. My room is a shrine to everything goth, black lace curtains, band posters, and shelves lined with manga that lean heavily into the macabre. I'm not into anime much, but there's something about the aesthetic of certain manga, Uzumaki, Tokyo Ghoul, Pet Shop of Horrors, that speaks to me. They're twisted, beautiful, and unapologetically dark, just like me. I work remotely in IT, which means I can dress however I want. Black lipstick, fishnets, and combat boots are my daily uniform. My housemates, Jen and Marco, are used to it by now. They're cool. Jen's a bartender at a dive bar, and Marco's a freelance graphic designer. We're not super close, but we get along well enough. They don't ask too many questions about my life, which I appreciate. I like my privacy, especially when it comes to my extracurricular activities. Let's just say I'm not just a dom in the bedroom. Sometimes I take on clients. It's not something I advertise, but it pays well, and I enjoy the control. There's something intoxicating about holding someone's trust in your hands, about knowing they'll do anything you say. It's a power I've always been comfortable with. But lately, something's felt off. It started small, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a faint whisper when I'm alone in my room. I'd turn around, and there'd be nothing there. Just the shadows, stretching longer than they should. I told myself it was stress or sleep deprivation. Work had been hectic, and I'd been pulling late nights. But the unease lingered, like a splinter under my skin. Then, one Friday night, I went to the goth club. It's my usual haunt, a place where I can lose myself in the music and the crowd. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of leather, the bass line of Bela Lugosi's Dead thrumming through the floor. I was at the bar, sipping a gin and tonic, when I felt someone's eyes on me. I turned, and there he was, tall with sharp features and eyes that seemed to drink in the light. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that looked like it belonged to another era. His hair slicked back in a way that made him look like a vampire straight out of a Hammer film. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't quite place. Not fear exactly, something darker. "You look like you're in charge," he said, his voice low and smooth. It wasn't a question. I raised an eyebrow, sipping my drink. "I am." He introduced himself as Lucien. No last name, just Lucien. We talked for hours about music, art, the things that lurked in the shadows. He was magnetic, the kind of person who made you feel like you were the only one in the room. When he asked if I wanted to leave with him, I didn't hesitate. That was my first mistake. The next few weeks were a blur. Lucien was unlike anyone I'd ever met. He was charming, intense, and always seemed to know exactly what I wanted before I did. But there was something off about him. He never talked about his past, and he always seemed to appear out of nowhere, like he'd been waiting in the shadows for me. I told myself it was part of his allure, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The dreams started soon after we met, vivid, unsettling dreams where I was no longer in control. In them, Lucian was always there, his eyes gleaming like shards of obsidian. He'd whisper things I couldn't quite hear, his voice curling around me like smoke. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, but when I looked around my room, everything was normal. Just the shadows, stretching longer than they should. Then came the mirrors. I've always liked mirrors. They're practical, sure, but there's also something fascinating about them, the way they reflect the world, but never quite perfectly. Lately, though, my reflection had started to misbehave. I'd catch it moving when I wasn't, or smiling when I wasn't. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw it. I was brushing my hair, my reflection mimicking my movements, when it stopped. Just stopped. I froze, my hand halfway through a stroke, and my reflection tilted its head, its lips curling into a smile that wasn't mine. I dropped the brush, my heart slamming against my ribs, and when I looked again, my reflection was normal. Just me, wide-eyed and pale, staring back. I told myself it was stress. I'd been working too hard, sleeping too little, but the unease stayed with me, a constant hum in the back of my mind. Things came to a head one night at the club. Lucian was there, as he always seemed to be, and we were dancing, the music pulsing around us like a living thing. His hands were on my waist, his breath hot against my neck, and for a moment I forgot about the dreams, the mirrors, the whispers. But then he leaned in close, his lips brushing my ear, and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "You're not in control anymore." I pulled away, my heart racing, but when I looked at him, his expression was calm, almost amused. "What did you say?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. He just smiled. "You'll see." I left the club alone that night, my mind racing. When I got home, I locked my door and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I noticed it, a shadow in the corner of my room, darker than the others. It seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone, and as I watched, it began to take shape. A figure, tall and slender, with eyes that glowed like embers. It stepped forward, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it was me, or rather a twisted version of me, my reflection, but wrong. Its smile was too wide, its eyes too bright, and when it spoke, its voice was a perfect mimicry of my own. "You thought you were in control," it said, tilting its head, "but you never were." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, its shadowy form shifting and writhing like smoke, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't just a reflection. It was something else, something that had been waiting, watching, biding its time, and now it was free. The next morning, I woke up in my bed, my head pounding and my sheets tangled around me. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but then I saw it, the mirror above my dresser, cracked down the middle, and the faint outline of a handprint on the glass. I haven't seen Lucian since that night, but sometimes when I'm alone in my room, I feel his presence, like a shadow just out of sight. And when I look in the mirror, I can't shake the feeling that my reflection is still watching me, waiting for the moment when it can take control again. Because the truth is, I'm not in control anymore, and I don't think I ever will be. It was an unusually humid night in Tampa when Natalie walked into Crimson Roast, the independent coffee shop she'd been visiting for the past few months. The city had settled into a soft hum of distant traffic, but the air was thick and still, as if the night itself was holding its breath. She pushed open the door, the bell chiming faintly above her head. She was a Virgo by star, Scorpio by heart, dark, restless. The heat of the Florida night clung to her skin, but she liked it. It felt alive. As much as she hated the sticky, sweat-drenched air, she couldn't resist its pull. The stillness of late-night Tampa, however, was what really drew her in. The world felt quieter here, in the shadows. Natalie was tall, slender, her bleached blonde hair now dyed jet black, styled in waves that framed her sharp features. She wore a black leather jacket over a faded band tee. The Cure, the Smiths, Smashing Pumpkins, her soul beat to the rhythm of these melancholy songs, reflecting the darkness she so carefully cultivated. She relished the sense of isolation that came with it, like music had become her escape, a place where she could disappear. Crimson Roast wasn't like the typical coffee shops around town. It was small, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. The walls were a dull shade of red, the worn-out wooden floor creaked with each step, and the light was dim, almost too dim. The space had an offbeat, grungy charm that appealed to people like Natalie, the ones who didn't fit into the mainstream. The place always felt like it was on the edge of something, as if it was teetering between being a hidden gem and something far more unsettling. Behind the counter stood a young man, pale with dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't smile as he noticed her entering, his gaze sharp as if appraising her, sizing her up. There was something about him that made Natalie uneasy, though she couldn't put her finger on it. She slid into a seat at the counter, her fingers drumming a rhythm of their own on the wooden surface. She needed a place to think, to tune out the world for a bit. The endless noise, the constant pulse of the city, it was all too much. This place, despite its strange aura, was familiar, comfortable. "A black coffee, please," she said, her voice low and steady. The barista didn't say a word. He nodded slowly, moving toward the espresso machine with a mechanical precision, his movements deliberate, almost too deliberate. Natalie stared at him for a moment, feeling a strange tightness in her chest. It wasn't just the tiredness in his eyes, it was the stillness in his presence. Something about the way he moved felt wrong, like he was holding something back, or perhaps trying not to be noticed. But why? She brushed off the feeling. Maybe it was just the late hour. As the machine hissed and steam rose from the spout, the shop felt quieter, the air thickening with an odd tension. It wasn't the kind of tension you could easily describe, but it gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. She looked around, but the small shop was empty. No one else was there, not even the usual late-night regulars. The coffee was ready, and the barista slid it toward her without a word. The steam curled up from the mug in a thin, ghostly tendril, but there was a bitter scent to it, more bitter than usual. She took a cautious sip, feeling a wave of discomfort rush over her. Something about the taste didn't sit right in her stomach. It wasn't bad, but it was strange. The warmth of it seemed to settle wrong, like it was somehow tainted. Her gaze flicked back to the barista, but he was already staring at her again, unblinking. Her fingers curled tightly around the cup as she felt a wave of unease settle in her chest. "Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to push the gnawing sense of discomfort out of her voice. He tilted his head slightly, almost as if he hadn't heard her. His eyes never left hers. "You're not supposed to be here," he said finally, his voice hollow, monotone. Natalie froze, her heart skipping. Her mind raced, trying to figure out if he was joking, if he was just messing with her in some strange way. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to sound calm, even though her pulse was beginning to race. "You don't belong here," he repeated, his eyes darkening, and he took a slow step closer to the counter. His expression hadn't changed, but his presence felt suffocating now, like he was closing in on her. A shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't like the feeling she'd had before. This wasn't just weird, it felt dangerous. For a moment she considered leaving, but something held her in place. The door to Crimson Roast creaked open, and she turned quickly, expecting someone to come in, someone to break the tension. But the street outside was empty, the faint glow of the streetlight casting long shadows along the pavement. Nothing was there. Just silence. Natalie stood abruptly, her stomach tightening with nerves. "I'm leaving," she said, the words coming out a little more forcefully than she meant. She tossed a crumpled bill on the counter and turned toward the door. As she reached for the handle, the barista spoke again, his voice softer, almost a whisper. "You won't be able to leave. You never can." Her hand froze on the door. Her breath caught in her throat. Was he threatening her? It didn't make sense. This was just some weird late-night encounter, nothing more, right? But why did the air suddenly feel so heavy? Why did the city outside seem so empty now? She stepped out into the humid night, but as soon as the door shut behind her, the unease stayed with her, a weight on her chest. The street was empty, quieter than usual. She glanced back at Crimson Roast, but the door was closed, the lights flickering inside. She couldn't see the barista anymore, but she didn't need to. The lingering feeling of being watched was enough to make her skin crawl. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe she was just tired. Or maybe it was the coffee. Something was off with that coffee. But as she walked down the street, something gnawed at her. Maybe it was the way the barista had looked at her, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that she had missed something important. Whatever it was, she couldn't shake it. As she turned the corner, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. Roast was gone. Just a vacant building. Empty. Silent. It was like it had never been there at all. And that concludes this week's chilling journey into the unknown. We hope these tales have left you looking over your shoulder and questioning the darkness around you. Craving more horror? Subscribe to our YouTube channel for even more terrifying tales. Until next time, remember, there are always more nightmares waiting to be told.